Thousands took to the streets in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi, to protest the surging violence against women and girls. But this problem is not unique to Kenya. In 2022, around 48,800 women and girls worldwide were killed by their intimate partners or other family members, according to a report by UN Women. In the same year, Africa recorded the largest absolute number of female intimate partner and family-related killings, with an estimated 20,000 victims. This week on the program, we turn the spotlight on the rising violence against women and girls in Africa and explore ways in which it can be stopped. I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. At least 162 countries have passed laws on domestic violence, but even when laws exist, this does not mean they are always implemented or enforced. Before we begin our discussion, my colleague 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐤 brings us this report.
Thousands of Kenyans poured out onto the streets of the capital, Nairobi. They carried banners boldly denouncing femicide. Femicide refers to the killing of a woman or girl, in particular by a man, and on account of her gender. Activists at the march wanted to raise attention to what they called a worrying trend in the country. Femicide Count Kenya, a non-governmental organization, estimates that in 2022, 152 Kenyan women were killed in cases of intimate partner violence. Now, recent numbers are not so clear. However, in recent weeks, the country has seen stories of femicide making headlines across the country. On 4th of January this year, 𝐀𝐟𝐫𝐢𝐜𝐚, a young Kenyan woman popular on social media as an influencer, was reportedly stabbed to death by a man alleged to have been part of a criminal ring targeting women on dating sites. She had met him at a short-stay apartment in Nairobi. Just 6 days later, another young Kenyan woman, Rita Waini, was reportedly drugged and dismembered by a man she met in a rented apartment. Her body parts were found in plastic bags. In recent days, the list of women killed by men has continued to grow longer, sparking fears of a worsening situation. For Morina Kinyi, the march hit close to home. She carries the scars of gender-based violence.
It was the man I lived with. I don't know what he was thinking really when it happened, but I fought back and suffered knife injuries, and that's when I left.
Experts say gender-based violence and femicide are closely linked, as most women are killed by someone known to them. It's unclear why the killings have become increasingly commonplace, but experts say the society can play a part in changing the situation by addressing attitudes towards girls and women.
We still don't respect, unfortunately, we still don't respect women and girls. We don't respect women and girls' rights. We still don't consider women as part of our society. Until we do that, we're not going to see any real change.
So you find that because you've been raised in a society where the value of a woman is pegged on how they behave, they have to be, subservient, they have to be a caregiver. If a woman goes against this and is maybe, considered a rebel, you find that now society will act against that.
As he marched, members of the public asked the government to take action to put in place measures to halt the killings and bring perpetrators of such crimes to book. Although the police service is yet to comment publicly on these latest calls, it has in the past said that it had set up special desks to attend to gender-related crimes. For women like Maureen, every little step helps to move the ball forward. She believes creating awareness could save a life, and that's why she and many others joined the march. 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐤, CGTN, Nairobi.
Well, joining me now to discuss the rising violence against women and girls are from Johannesburg, Themba Masango, Secretary General of Not In My Name, a South African-based civil rights movement. From Nairobi, Sunita Kaminha, Policy Specialist, Ending Violence Against Women with the United Nations Women, East and Southern Africa. And with me here in studio, Cynthia Lolo, gender and reproductive health analyst. Welcome everyone to the program. Sunita, I want to start with the UN Women Report that indicates that in 2022, around 48,800 women and girls worldwide were killed by their intimate partners or other family members, meaning that on average, more than 133 women or girls are killed every day by someone in their own family. Just update us on how bad it is.
The situation is indeed very dire and very urgent. We know that femicide, the intentional killing of women, is one of the many forms of violence against women that manifest in our society today. And femicide is probably the most extreme form which results in death. But we know that there are all too many women and girls experiencing other forms of violence often within the home, from an intimate partner or someone in their family, from someone known to them, or in spaces where they should be educated, or where they're working, or in public spaces. So there's no actual space that's free from violence against women and girls. The data from the UN Women and UN ODC report that just came out in November last year, it did show indeed that there's an increase. It was the highest, the 2022 data, which was released in 2023, was the highest numbers of femicides actually in the decade of reporting. And that really does show the need for more urgent action around this area and the extreme concern. And we see that that's also linked to the crisis, that the various crises that we see happening around us in the region and beyond.
Yeah, so Sunita, you talk about these numbers being the highest figures, in the last how many years, but are we seeing it getting worse for that matter, or is it just a matter of it is getting more highlighted now? There is more awareness as a result of social media, as a result of, organizations such as yourself. What is it?
I think it's a combination of factors. So I think what we can see is that we know in times of crisis, violence against women and girls is exacerbated. We saw that, and we had data from that from the COVID-19 pandemic. We see that and have data again showing in times of conflict and displacement, women and girls are most affected, and we do see the exacerbation and increase in violence in those contexts, as well as crisis related to climate or economic shocks. So we know that as we see increasing fragility and increasing crisis in the world around us and in the region, that violence is exacerbated. At the same time, we are seeing more investments in actually identification of different forms of violence and collecting data on that, which starts to really show the trends. So I think it is increasing while we are starting to better understand what the data actually is telling us and why it's happening.
Lolo, you support survivors of abuse. What are you seeing?
Well, I mean, just to piggyback on what she said in regards to how there is a crisis and that's what leads to an increase in gender-based violence. The one aspect that I feel like a lot of the data is not representing is that what we are seeing now is an identity crisis, not just with the economic, situation, but we see that a lot of men are dealing with an identity issue in the sense that they grew up in a time where they were told that a man is meant to do this, a man is meant to have a woman that is meant to serve him. But now you live in a century where the women are also going to work. Women have that same kind of power as well. So that, shift in identity, shift in power structure is one of the causes for the increase of gender-based violence that we are seeing in our society as well. And in terms of supporting victims of violence, I guess that's your question you asked me.
Yes.
In terms of supporting victims of violence, the first thing is really breaking away from the shame and stigma around it. Because someone who has been violated, you'll be surprised that the hardest thing is for them to actually tell someone that they have been violated. And I think it's because there's a lot of shame around it. The fact that they themselves cannot even admit that they were violated. And the extra layer is the fact that, okay, if I tell you that this person violated me, do I have the power to actually leave that situation? So it's a very multifaceted, issue. And when we're talking about violence, I don't want us to only look at it from the data, but from like interpersonal relationship. Right. Are you a safe space that your friend can even talk to when they are going through a traumatic experience as well?
I want to stay a little bit on that whole question of stigma, because the UN Women's Report, which I'm going to refer to a little bit, says globally 6% of women report that they have been subjected to sexual violence from someone other than their husband or a partner, but they do not report it because of this whole question of stigma.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with that?
I mean, the first thing is what we are doing right now, having open conversations around this issue around GBV, and 6%, I believe that's incredibly underrepresented. You bring a room of 10 women, at least 6 of them will tell you that they have been assaulted one time in their life. So I think think it's about creating open spaces where women can have this discussion. We live in a technological world right now, so a lot of this conversation are also happening online, which is giving women the opportunity and the power to actually speak out, which goes back to the question you asked in regards to, are we having more increased cases, or are women just speaking up? Because now women know that there is solidarity. That's something that was happening to me at home. I come online and I see 10 other women from different parts of the world. I begin to recognize it's not an isolated case. It's actually a systematic issue. So the first way to move away from breaking the shame and stigma around gender-based violence is by creating safe spaces where women can actually talk about these issues, and ensuring that, you know, the legal and the government actually put out punishment, because it's very infuriating if we keep on talking about this issue that we're dealing with. Sometimes we even highlight the perpetrators of this violence, but the next day we see them roaming the street with us as well. So it feels like a double-edged sword in the sense that you put us in the bubble where we are speaking out, but there is no act of justice being done. And you know, for any form of peace, there has to be justice.
Right. We're going to talk about policy in a minute. But Themba, let me bring you in here, because the rate of violence against women and girls in South Africa is among the highest in the world and has even been described as a second pandemic. Give us your perspective from South Africa.
Indeed, 100%, you know, gender-based violence and femicide continues to be a scourge to our society. As you know, in South Africa, our femicide rate stands at about 5.1 times higher than anywhere in the world. We are sadly known as the rape capital of the world. So it remains to be a scourge, and yes, many have called it a second pandemic. Women are the ones that you know, are at the butt end of the violence, especially when it comes to rape and femicide itself. You know, in their majority, it's almost at 70 to 75% when you look at the genders in the country. And that is why organizations such as Not In My Name are trying to fight the scourge, particularly from the point of view of men. Because we believe that it will, you know, in order for you to get to a root cause of the problem, you need to get, you know, those that necessarily sometimes are the causes of the problem, and that's men, and we need to be the ones that speak to and at each other.
Lolo, are we finding that sub-Saharan Africa is still under represented when it comes to the measures that are in place in terms of policy?
Absolutely. I mean, listen, even the thing about sub-Saharan Africa, what I've noticed is working in the grassroots is there is a disconnect between the policy and what's happening on the ground. So even when we have policies, you know, put in place and talking about how a perpetrator of violence is meant to go to prison for this amount of time, people on the grassroots don't even know that. The police officer you're going to does not even know the policy. He's going to tell you to go back home, that it's a family affair. So when we come to sub-Saharan Africa, I believe that what we need to do is to create a synergy from what's happening in those rooms and policies and what's happening in the grassroots. We need to ensure that people in the grassroots actually have access to what's happening there and actually have the opportunity to air their voices as well.
Sunita, who is most at risk here? Because when we talk about, you know, there's an identity crisis. You know, there are people who are suffering more from family members. Who here is most at risk? How is this violence manifesting itself? What are you seeing?
So when we look at gender-based violence or violence against women, at the root of this is power imbalances based on gender, a gender hierarchy and patriarchal structures that we can see in all aspects of our society. So when we're looking at who is most affected, we have to look at, well, who has less power in society? When we look at gender identity and we look at which groups of women and girls are facing multiple forms of discrimination, whether that's because of their age, whether that's because of their background, the work that they do, their gender identity or sexual orientation, if they're displaced. So we also see that increasingly, given the shrinking civic space in the region and beyond, that women who are challenging the status quo, whether that's women human rights defenders, whether that's those in politics, journalists at times as well, we see that they are also being targeted for this abuse because of that, you know, that they're speaking out and they're challenging this power structure that exists. So, you know, looking at power is really an important element as we're trying to unpack and analyze best ways to address this this pandemic of violence.
We saw a recent surge in violence, outside of South Africa. We saw a recent surge in violence against women in Kenya. And we did see a lot of people putting the blame on economic inequalities here. I want you to weigh on this, Themba. How much blame can we put on economic circumstances, cultural or technological issues such as the rise of social media, dating apps in the escalating violence against women?
Violence was always there, even before the advent of social media or media. It's just that now it is amplified because the world has become such a small place, and we've seen the violent spurts that have come up and the numbers that have come up horribly in places such as Kenya. And, we cannot necessarily blame socioeconomics, though socioeconomics do play a role, because obviously, sometimes the man is unemployed, the man has got no way to provide, and he feels inadequate and, emasculated, and that causes some form of anger and so on. But that is not an excuse, because, whether you are in a privileged or unprivileged position, violence can never be an answer. Violence can never be, a scapegoat. So we usually call that a cop-out, and it's an excuse, even though it is a reality that does exist. And it's societal norms. You amongst us as African people, that once you've paid lobola, a lot of men feel that it's no longer a partnership, they own the woman. And that's also those norms that we have to change, and the mindset that we have to look at, so that we can change a perpetrator's mind and ultimately negative behavior.
All right, very interesting discussion there, but we are going to take a short break. When we come back, we'll have more on how this rising tide of violence against women and girls can be addressed. To stay with us. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Themba Masango, Sunita Kamina, and Lolo Cynthia. Before the break, we looked at why violence targeting women and girls is rising. Let's now look at some ways it can be addressed. Sunita, let me come to you first. You were a part of the anti-femicide demonstrations recently held across Kenya, and these were the largest ever against sexual and gender-based violence in the country. Walk us through why they were held, and did they achieve what the organizers hoped they would?
I think this was a really powerful example of what collective action can look like in practice. As you said, there were demonstrations in different cities around Kenya that were mobilized by women's rights organizations and civil society who had been working on this issue, not just now, but over years, monitoring the situation around femicides and other forms of gender-based violence in Kenya, and identifying this surge of cases of femicide in 2023, as well as at the start of 2024. And that called for kind of this collective action to say, let's come together. We need to say that this needs to be recognized as an alarming problem and needs to be addressed for its urgency. I think what we saw, and I had the privilege to participate with my daughter, and it was so powerful because you saw so many different organizations coming out in solidarity. You saw men and women, children, different parts of society coming out to be, to speak with the same voice, that this cannot be tolerated, that action needs to be taken, and there needs to be consequences to this type of violence. And I think what we need to continue is to say, how do we put that level of collective force into making sure that the laws and policies are implemented into making sure that those in leadership positions are held to account for those commitments, that we are, that the society is watching, and these issues are of concern to all, because it is something that concerns everyone. Everyone is affected by violence against women and girls, whether directly or indirectly. And so until everyone feels that urgency to act, we won't see change.
So Lola, I want to get an issue here from a victim's perspective. If one is to protect themselves, first, what are the telltale signs that they need to look out for? And secondly, what are the processes? Where does one go? What happens next?
Okay, so the first one about the telltale signs is, before a man physically hits you, he starts to emotionally abuse you. So the fact that he's intimidating you, he's harassing you, he's making you feel small, those are some of the signs. Most time when women were in the love bubble, we feel like, oh, that's just how he is, or he's going to change. It's like, no. He first of all starts with emotional abuse, and then he yells at you, and then he hits you, he strangles you, and he goes to death. So there are stages of it. And somehow you see those things, in those stages. And it's easier for you to leave in the beginning, but it doesn't mean that you cannot leave also at the end. So in terms of finding, sources or resources out there, the first thing I'll say is come online. If you have your phone, women, you have a smartphone. If you Google any shelter, if you Google any helpline, if you Google NGO, there are so many of them wherever you are. You can start by doing that. If you do not have the strength to leave at that moment, maybe all you need to do is just read articles about other women who have found strength, because it's not something that happens the next day. Also, if you're trying to leave an abusive relationship, you have to carefully plan your exit, because we know that women who try to leave are actually at a higher risk of being violated or even killed because of, leaving that. So you have to plan this carefully. You have to have one or two friends that you can confide in, and they can let you know. But most especially, and I know because of the society we live in and the system, it's difficult for people to report. But the first thing you also need to have is proof of abuse. You need to have that proof. You need to go to the police and report. Even if you don't take it up, you need to at least have documentation. Because what happens in some cases where, you violate me and I hit you back or I do something, what is the proof that I can show the court that this is self-defense? Right. So there are so many stages, but these are some of the things that I do want women to just look into if they're in those kind of situations.
So let's look back at South Africa again here. Are there any successful strategies that have effectively reduced, or any measures that have been put in place that have effectively reduced the femicide rates?
Well, I think what's important is that everybody in society, specifically the government, needs to make sure that it becomes a national issue, so there is clear focus on it, from the policing part of it to the the courts. Make sure that cases that are put out, that rapists and such people do not even qualify for bail. And when you see such moves, it will strengthen the faith of people in your legal and justice systems. So those need to be tightened up. The laws need to be clear, that they are not going to tolerate people who are murderers and people who commit femicide and such things.
Sunita, I want to get a final comment from you. And we've talked about the legal systems, the various regions, the ones that are adequate or inadequate. Are there successful models, though, or strategies that have been effectively used to reduce femicide rates across the globe?
Absolutely, and I think if we recognize that femicide is, as Lola was saying, there are signs that come before it, right? And it is I think a symptom of a system that has failed. And so what we've seen is that when there is adequate monitoring of femicide cases and unpacking, there are observatories that track femicide and actually look at what are trends in cases. Where is it that the support services for survivors failed to identify the risk? When there is investment in data, so we have seen an increase in the number of countries that actually collect data on femicide, and that's an important angle. there's also the importance of what we saw in Kenya, the women's rights organizations, civil society organizations having resources to monitor cases, because we know that not all cases will be reported. We know that sometimes that information will come through family or friends, but it might not always go to the police registers. And then having functional referrals and multi-sectoral services for survivors, because we know that that will ultimately, when survivors first experience violence, when there is an opportunity to leave an abusive situation or to hold perpetrators to account, that's when there's an opportunity to prevent a femicide. And so having those systems functional, resourced, and making sure that those service providers are equipped with the knowledge to really be able to respond adequately and really hear from survivors, making sure that they are able to feed into those systems to say, this is my experience, how do we improve the system so that it can respond and evolve with what we're seeing changing in terms of online and technology facilitated gender-based violence. The service providers need to be able to respond to those types of abuse.
Right. So, Themba, I want to get your final comments, and I just want to give you some statistics from the World Health Organization that says today, globally, 1 in 3 women have been subjected to either physical or intimate partner violence in their lifetime. What should be the role of communities? How can the fight against gender-based violence be reconfigured to make it more effective?
That's true, and that stat is actually a stat that is very shocking and scary. That 1 in 3 women globally are victims of violence, and this is another call for us all to create social cohesion, specifically to men and to young boys, to say that we will not tolerate those amongst us who are abusers, rapists and murderers, and we say not in my name to those people, and we must take drastic and serious action against those by making sure that we shun those amongst us who are of that nature. We expose those amongst us and we get them arrested, and we need to have the justice system on the side of the victim to make sure that would-be perpetrators are also scared of actually continuing with such.
Lolo, yes, your final thoughts as you wind up, but I also want to hear from you if you think society is making strides in addressing this crisis, or we're losing it.
I think we're making strides. I think women are more vocal than ever. And that's actually what, it's crazy because it seems like a catch-22. Because of how much strides we're making in it, that's why there's an increase in gender-based violence, because we're talking about power imbalance. Women are gaining power and men are starting to feel like they need to take their power back and reclaiming it. They're doing that through violence. So that is something that I see, but I'm really happy with the way women are going. I'm really happy that we have our Gen Zs, these young girls. They are not like us. They know what they're saying, but it also means that we are seeing an increase in violence from a younger age. Teenagers are now in, intimate relationship that it's violence as well. So we need to start, tackling these things from when they're really young. And I would say that my final word is technology has really changed the game when it comes to the kind of violence that we're experiencing, the impersonation. These are things that it wouldn't have been a big issue in the past, but now we see men impersonating women to actually inflict violence on other women. We see cyberbullying, we see a lot of those things. So that's something that we definitely should pay attention to. I can guarantee you that every time there is a football match, depending on who loses, women are the ones that bear the consequences of men's emotional outbursts. So we need men to be out there, talking to their other men, that there are other ways that you can deal with your emotions. Yeah.
All right, very insightful discussion there, but that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all our guests: Themba Masango, Secretary General of Not In My Name, a South African-based civil rights movement; Sunita Kaminha, Policy Specialist, Ending Violence Against Women with the United Nations Women; and Lolo Cynthia, Gender and Reproductive Health Analyst. If you require further information about a situation related to gender-based violence, please use the contacts on the screen. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, it's goodbye for now.